50 chapters. That's the whole of Genesis, start to finish. Most people read it like a straight line. Creation, then a fall, then some flood, then a family saga that eventually ends up in Egypt. A story that just moves forward, one event after another, the way you'd read a history book. I want to show you something today that changes how you'll ever read this book again, for good. Genesis doesn't just move forward. It folds back on itself. Events, phrases, even entire plot shapes from the first 11 chapters get repeated, mirrored, and echoed by the stories of the patriarchs later on. Not by accident, but because somebody built this book with an architecture almost nobody points out from the pulpit. Here's the first clue, sitting in plain sight the whole time. 10 times in Genesis, and only in Genesis, you hit the same phrase. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. The generations of Adam, of Noah, of Noah's sons, of Shem, of Terah, of Ishmael, of Isaac, of Esau, of Jacob. 10 formal headings, like 10 distinct chapter markers placed deliberately by an editor, dividing this 50-chapter sprawl into distinct, connected sections. Once you see those 10 headings, you start noticing something stranger. The stories inside those sections don't just sit next to each other. They rhyme with each other. A younger son gets chosen over an older one, again and again. A famine sends someone into danger, again and again. A wife gets passed off as a sister to protect a husband's life, not once, but 3 separate times across 2 generations. A brother's rage nearly costs another brother his life, echoed generation after generation, family after family. This isn't coincidence. This is a book built with deliberate, recurring shapes, the same way a great piece of music returns to its opening melody in the final movement, changed just enough that you feel the connection without it ever being spelled out. Stay with me. I'm going to walk you through the actual architecture hiding inside the most read book in the Bible, the one almost nobody stops to actually look at as a whole. I think part of why we miss this is because we're taught to read Genesis in fragments. A Sunday school lesson on Noah here, a sermon on Abraham's faith there, a children's story about Joseph's coat somewhere else. Each piece gets isolated, polished, and handed to you separately, like admiring individual bricks pulled out of a cathedral wall one at a time. Nobody ever steps back far enough to see that the bricks were laid in a pattern, and that the pattern itself is trying to tell you something the individual stories, read alone, simply can't. Before you even reach Abraham, the first 11 chapters of Genesis already contain their own internal mirror, and it's one of the most carefully constructed passages in the whole Bible, the flood story. Scholars have mapped this out for decades, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. The flood narrative in Genesis 6 through 9 is built as a chiasm, a structure that rises to a center point and then mirrors itself coming back down, like a set of stairs going up and then down the exact same steps in reverse. It starts with God noticing the corruption of the earth. It ends with God noticing the earth is dry again. It moves through Noah entering the ark, the rains starting, the waters rising, and then at the very center of the entire structure, this single line, God remembered Noah. Everything before that line has been rising water and rising judgment. Everything after that line is falling water and returning order. The waters recede in the same stages, in reverse order that they rose. The birds get sent out in a reversed sequence of the animals that entered. The whole story is engineered to pivot on that one sentence sitting dead center, God remembered. That detail should stop you. In the middle of the most devastating judgment in the ancient world, the narrative doesn't structure itself around the destruction. It structures itself around the turning point of mercy. The architecture itself is preaching something the plot alone wouldn't tell you as clearly. Judgment is real, but it was never the center of the story. Remembering was. Look even closer at how precisely this mirroring works. 7 days before the flood, God tells Noah to enter the ark. 40 days and nights of rain follow. The waters prevail 150 days. Then, on the other side of the center point, the waters recede for 150 days. Noah sends out a raven, then a dove 3 separate times. in a careful sequence until dry ground finally appears, and the whole timeline mirrors itself with an almost mathematical precision that no accidental oral retelling would likely preserve. Someone counted these days on purpose. Someone built this shape intentionally, the way an architect measures a building to make sure both wings match. And this same instinct, building meaning into the shape of the text, not just the content of it, shows up again just a few chapters later at Babel. Humanity tries to build a name for itself, reaching up toward heaven. God comes down, scatters the nations, and confuses the language. Then, almost immediately, chapter 12 opens with God calling one man, Abram, promising to make his name great and to bless all the families of the earth through him. Babel scatters humanity through pride reaching upward. Abraham's calling begins gathering humanity back through a blessing reaching outward. The primeval history ends in fragmentation. The patriarchal history begins with the cure already in motion. Notice the specific reversal buried in that transition too. At Babel, humanity says, "Let's make a name for ourselves." At the call of Abram, God says, "I will make your name great." The exact same ambition, a great name, shows up in both stories, but one version is humanity grasping for it through self-exaltation, and the other is God freely giving it as a gift. The text doesn't need to explain that contrast outright. It just places the two stories back to back and trusts you to notice the echo. Now watch the pattern that refuses to quit for the rest of the entire book. Cain, the firstborn, is passed over. Abel, and later, after Cain's line fails, Seth carries the promise forward instead. Ishmael, born first to Abraham, is set aside. Isaac, born through impossible promise rather than human effort, inherits the covenant. Esau, the firstborn twin, sells his birthright and loses the blessing. Jacob, the younger, walks away with both. And generations later, Jacob himself, blind and dying, crosses his hands on purpose to bless Joseph's younger son Ephraim above the firstborn Manasseh, saying the younger will become greater. For separate generations, the same exact reversal, every time, the expected heir set aside, the unexpected one chosen instead. If this happened once, you'd call it an interesting detail. Twice, a coincidence worth a footnote. 4 times, across 4 completely different families and 4 completely different sets of circumstances, spanning the entire book from Genesis 4 to Genesis 48? That's not coincidence. That's a thesis statement, repeated on purpose, so that no reader could possibly miss it. God's choice was never going to run on the world's ordinary rules of birth order, strength, or human entitlement. This pattern does something else too. It keeps you from getting too comfortable with any one family as the obvious heroes of the story. Isaac isn't chosen because he earned it over Ishmael. Jacob is, by his own actions early on, one of the most morally compromised figures in the entire book, a deceiver, twice over, who tricks his father and cheats his brother. And he's still the one carrying the promise forward. The pattern isn't rewarding good behavior. It's demonstrating, again and again, that the promise moves forward by God's choice, not by human merit, birth order, or deserving. That's a hard thing to sit with if you've ever assumed Scripture rewards the reader's favorite kind of person. It doesn't. It keeps choosing the second son, the deceiver, the barren womb, the family nobody would have picked. There's an added layer worth noticing in how each of these reversals gets contested. Ishmael's mother, Hagar, is cast out into the wilderness, and God meets her there directly, promising her own son will become a great nation. The rejected line still gets seen, still gets blessed, just not with the specific covenant promise. Esau, weeping bitterly after losing his blessing, still receives his own portion from his father, and the text never treats him with contempt, even while the covenant clearly moves through Jacob instead. The pattern of reversal isn't a pattern of cruelty toward whoever gets set aside. It's a pattern that keeps insisting the main covenant line was never a matter of superiority, only a matter of a promise that had to travel somewhere specific for reasons the text keeps insisting are God's to make, not the family's to earn. Look closely at the wife-sister deception, and you'll find it happening 3 separate times in Genesis, twice with Abraham, in Egypt and later in Gerar, and once with his son Isaac, in that same region of Gerar, with practically the same king. Each time, a patriarch, afraid for his life because his wife is beautiful, claims she's only his sister. Each time, a foreign ruler nearly takes her. Each time, God intervenes and exposes the deception before real harm is done. Read once, it looks like an odd repeated anecdote. Read as part of the whole book's architecture. It becomes a recurring test of whether the covenant family will trust God's protection or manage the danger through their own half-truths. And the answer, generation after generation, is a very human mixture of both. It's worth noticing, too, how the text refuses to smooth these moments over into flattering portraits of its own patriarchs. A modern author writing propaganda for a founding family would likely edit out 3 separate instances of a leader lying about his own wife to save his own skin. Genesis keeps all 3 unflinchingly across 2 generations, which tells you something about what this book was actually trying to accomplish. It wasn't building a flawless origin myth. It was tracking how a promise survives despite the very real, repeated moral failures of the people carrying it, which might be the most quietly reassuring pattern in the entire architecture if you've ever doubted whether your own failures disqualify you from whatever you've been called to carry forward. Then there's famine. Abraham goes down to Egypt because of famine in the land. Generations later, Jacob's entire family goes down to Egypt because of famine in the land. Except this time, the famine becomes the very mechanism that relocates the covenant family into the exact place their descendants will eventually need liberating from centuries later. The same crisis, reused as a plot engine, moves the story forward at 2 completely different points in the timeline, each time relocating the promise-bearing family toward the next chapter of what God is doing. Even the emotional texture of these 2 famine journeys echoes each other. Abraham arrives in Egypt as a frightened man managing a threat through deception. Jacob's sons arrive generations later as frightened men, uncertain whether the powerful Egyptian official standing before them recognizes who they are, carrying their own guilt over what they did to Joseph years earlier. Both arrivals in Egypt are marked by fear and concealment before they resolve into safety. The shape of the anxiety matches, even though the specific danger and the specific deception are entirely different. And then there's Joseph, arguably the most elegant echo in the whole book. He's the beloved son of an aging father, just like Isaac was. He's hated and nearly killed by his own brothers, echoing Cain and Abel, except this time the murder gets stopped and turned into a sale into slavery instead. He rises through impossible reversal, from a pit to a prison to a palace, the pattern of the lowest becoming exalted, repeating one more time on the grandest scale the book has shown yet. By the time Joseph tells his brothers, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good," he's summarizing the theological engine that's been running underneath every single reversal since Cain and Abel. Evil intentions, repeatedly, get folded into a larger purpose their authors never saw coming. Even the smaller details echo across the generations if you look closely enough. Abraham's servant finds Rebekah at a well. Jacob meets Rachel at a well. Moses, generations later, and technically outside Genesis, but clearly following the same narrative grammar, meets his future wife Zipporah at a well too. A garment plays a decisive, damning role more than once. Jacob deceives his father using his brother's clothing and goat skins, and years later Joseph's own brothers deceive their father using Joseph's torn and bloodied coat as false evidence of his death. The very device used to steal a blessing becomes the device used to fake a death generations later inside the same family line, as if the narrator wants you to feel the family's patterns of deception coming back around on itself. So why does any of this matter? Why would an ancient author or a group of editors go through the trouble of building repeating shapes into 50 chapters instead of just telling the story once and moving on? Because repetition in ancient literature wasn't considered a flaw to hide. It was considered a teaching tool. when the same shape shows up in 4 different families across 400 years of narrative time, you're not looking at laziness or coincidence. You're looking at a deliberate signature, insisting that the pattern itself is the point. God works through reversal, through unexpected choices, through people who did not deserve the position they were placed in, every single time on purpose, not by accident. Think about what this means for how the whole book is meant to be read. Genesis isn't a loose collection of ancient family stories somebody happened to preserve. It's a carefully constructed argument, made almost entirely through structure rather than direct statement, that the God introduced in chapter 1. The one who spoke order out of chaos, who structured even the flood narrative around a center point of remembering mercy, never stopped operating that same way through every single generation that followed. The architecture of the beginning becomes the blueprint for everything after it. Consider, too, how this same design instinct explains why Genesis ends where it does, rather than continuing straight into the Exodus story the way a simple chronological history might. It ends with Joseph in a coffin in Egypt, still holding on to the promise that God will one day bring his descendants back to the land sworn to Abraham. The book that opened with God speaking the world into order out of formless chaos closes with a man's bones waiting in a foreign land for a promise not yet fulfilled, an unresolved chord on purpose, structured to make the reader lean forward into whatever comes next, exactly the way the flood story leaned toward its center point of remembering, exactly the way Babel's fragmentation leaned toward Abraham's calling. The whole book, right down to its final sentence, keeps teaching you the same lesson in its very shape. The story isn't finished, and the pattern isn't finished either. And I think there's something for you in this too, if you're willing to receive it. If you've ever felt like the second choice, the passed over one, the person nobody expected anything significant from, you're standing inside the exact pattern this entire book keeps repeating on purpose. Cain was the firstborn and was set aside. Ishmael was born first and was set aside. Esau came out first and lost the blessing. Manasseh was older and got crossed over. The architecture of Genesis isn't in your way. It's evidence of exactly how this story tends to move. Not around the expected, through the overlooked every single time, until the whole thing finally arrives at Egypt, waiting for its next reversal to begin. There's one more thing worth carrying out of this, past the literary craftsmanship itself. If a group of ancient editors cared enough to build symmetry this precise into 50 chapters of family history, using nothing but careful placement, repeated phrases, and mirrored plot shapes, it tells you something about how seriously they believed the smallest details of these stories mattered. Nothing here was thrown together carelessly. Every genealogy, every well, every stolen birthright, every torn garment was placed exactly where it needed to be, so that 3,500 years later, you could sit here, notice the pattern, and realize the same God who kept choosing the overlooked person back then hasn't changed how he tends to work since, and likely hasn't changed how he's working in the overlooked corners of your own life either.